Welcome back to Masterminds and Wisdom. So excited to dive into another book picked by you, our awesome listeners. Today, we're tackling The Dawn of Everything.
Yeah, The Dawn of Everything, a new history of humanity. This one's by David Graeber and David Wengrow.
It's a serious brain twister, this book. It makes you rethink everything you thought you knew about, well, how humans got to where we are today.
Absolutely. Graeber and Wengrow just toss out a lot of those old stories about how societies developed, like that whole idea of the noble savage. They just dismantle it.
Yeah, that idea that indigenous people were all living in perfect harmony with nature until Europeans showed up and ruined everything.
Right, that romanticized version. The authors point out that this was often used to justify, not so great things like colonialism.
Exactly. But they make a good point. Those early Europeans who wrote about indigenous Americans actually described societies that were, well, more complex.
Yeah, much more nuance. They saw both good and bad, just like any other group of people.
And get this, those early encounters weren't just one-sided. There was actual dialogue happening.
Oh yeah, real intellectual exchange going on. The book talks about this Wendat statesman, Kandiarank, who was basically dissecting European society, pointing out all its flaws.
Hold on, so indigenous thinkers were actually influencing those big Enlightenment ideas about freedom and equality, the ones we usually credit to European philosophers.
That's what Graeber and Wengrow argue, yeah. It flips the script, makes you realize we often miss the contributions of so many people.
Wow. I'm already rethinking everything I thought I knew about this period.
Oh, so?
This challenge to how we think societies evolved, it goes way beyond those early encounters, right?
Oh, yeah. The dawn of everything goes deep, questioning this whole idea that humans went from simple hunter-gatherer bands straight to these big hierarchical states.
So it's not as straightforward as we've been led to believe.
Not even close. And they've got some archaeological evidence to back it up, like those princely burials from the Upper Paleolithic.
Those are the ones where they found, like, really fancy graves from way back then.
Right.
But those societies were supposed to be egalitarian.
Right. And some of those individuals had, different physical features, suggesting they weren't just your average Joe. Makes you wonder about the social structure back then.
So things were more complex than we thought, even way back then.
And they talk about this concept of reverse dominance.
Reverse dominance.
Yeah, where societies actively work to prevent anyone from getting too much power.
Huh. So instead of hierarchy being inevitable, they're saying humans always had the choice of how to organize themselves.
Exactly.
And they don't just stop at small-scale societies, right? The book also tackles how early cities challenge those traditional power structures.
Absolutely. They bring up these massive settlements in Ukraine going back to 4000 BC. No signs of kings or palaces or anything like that.
Wait, so big populations, sophisticated structures, but no obvious elite.
Nope. It really throws a wrench in that whole cities automatically mean hierarchies idea.
That's mind-blowing. So how did these cities function?
That's the big question. Graeber and Wengrow suggest they might have used councils, assemblies, ways of sharing power that we might not even recognize as government today.
That's fascinating. So even in those early cities, humans were already experimenting with different ways of living together. And this book challenges another big one, right? The agricultural revolution.
Oh, absolutely. They question that whole story that agriculture inevitably leads to, well, everything we know about civilization.
That classic tale. Humans discover farming, settle down, start producing extra food, and bam, hierarchy and inequality are born.
Yeah, that's the simplified version, but The Dawn of Everything argues it's much more complicated.
Okay, so how do they explain it?
They use this really interesting metaphor from Plato, The Gardens of Adonis. It was his way of criticizing farmers who focused on quick, showy plants instead of long-term yields.
So more about spectacle than substance, basically. How does that relate to early agriculture?
The authors suggest that early agriculture might have been more like that, experimental. Not necessarily the driving force behind societal change, but one piece of a much bigger puzzle.
So more about humans playing with their environment, figuring out how to grow things, rather than this sudden shift that changed everything.
Exactly. Plus, agriculture didn't just appear in one place and spread. There were multiple origins, different plants being domesticated at different times all over the world.
Okay, so a much more complex picture than what we usually hear. And the dawn of everything keeps going, right? They dig into the role of violence and care in how states form.
Oh yeah, they get into some heavy stuff. They argue that those two seemingly opposite things were actually central to how early states emerged.
That sounds paradoxical. How do they connect violence and care?
Well, they point out that early states often used very public displays of violence, like ritual killings.
Like a way to establish authority through fear.
It was about establishing authority, yes, but they also connect it to a sense of awe, even loyalty. They use the example of retainer burials in ancient Egypt.
Oh yeah, where people from the pharaoh's inner circle were buried with him, sometimes even sacrificed.
Right. A pretty chilling example, but they argue it shows how violence was intertwined with this deep sense of personal loyalty and belief in the ruler's divine right.
So it's not just about brute force, but about building a whole worldview that justifies those actions.
Exactly. And they also connect violence to the origins of bureaucracy, arguing it often came from a need to manage these increasingly complex societies.
And they bring up those Kipu systems again here, right?
Yep. Those knotted strings from the Andes, they weren't just about numbers, but also about managing labor and resources.
Right, like a physical accounting system.
Mm.
But the Inca Empire used them to track labor owed to the state, basically turning them into a tool of control.
Which shows how something meant for fairness can be twisted, used to reinforce power imbalances.
That's a pretty sobering thought. It makes you think about the systems we have today and whether they're truly serving their purpose. But the dawn of everything goes beyond just power, right? It also critiques how we categorize societies throughout history.
You're right. They argue that those neat timelines we use, they often reflect the biases of the people who created them.
We love to focus on those golden ages of stability and order.
Yeah. But those periods often had plenty of, violence and oppression going on behind the scenes.
So they're urging us to dig a little deeper, to see beyond those idealized versions of the past.
Exactly. Like, take the Egyptian Middle Kingdom.
That's the one known for its art and literature, right?
Right. But it was also a time of forced labor and military expansion. The dawn of everything wants us to look at the whole picture, not just the pretty parts.
Makes sense. So we need to be more critical of those historical narratives we get fed.
Absolutely. And to help us understand how different societies relate to each other, they introduce this concept of dark twins.
Dark twins. Okay, I'm intrigued.
They use it to describe the tension between what they call grain states and barbarian societies.
Okay, break that down for me. What are grain states?
Those are societies that relied heavily on grain crops, led to more settled lifestyles, surplus food, and often, more hierarchical structures.
Makes sense. And barbarian societies. I feel like that term has a lot of baggage.
Yeah, they acknowledge that, but they use it to refer to societies that existed alongside or in opposition to those grain states.
So more mobile, less hierarchical.
Often, yeah. They emphasize things like personal freedom, heroism, loyalty, values that clashed with those of the grain states.
So it's like these two contrasting models of society playing out throughout history.
Mm.
But the dawn of everything argues that we shouldn't see the barbarians as simply less advanced.
Exactly. They represented different ways of being human, different values.
And this all ties into a bigger question. What even is progress?
Right. We often think of history as the straight line from simple to complex, but the dawn of everything throws that whole idea out the window.
So are they saying progress doesn't exist?
Not necessarily. It's more about recognizing that it's not a simple upward climb. Human history is messy, full of twists and turns. And maybe we should rethink how we measure it.
Focus on things like freedom and well-being instead of just technology or power.
That's the idea.
Wow, this is already a lot to process. I feel like we're just scratching the surface here.
Oh, we are. The dawn of everything is packed with so many ideas that challenge the way we think about history and, well, ourselves.
Can't wait to dive deeper.
Me too. One of the things that really hits you when you read The Dawn of Everything is how it makes you rethink not just the past, but the future, too.
Yeah, it's like they're saying, hold on. If humans were capable of creating all these different types of societies throughout history, why are we stuck thinking this is the only way?
Right, like we're limited to just this one path. And they point out how often we focus on those periods of order and stability, the ones that look nice and neat in history books.
And we kind of gloss over those messy times of upheaval and change.
Exactly, those dark ages, as they often get called. But those periods might be the most important for understanding how societies really evolve.
Huh, I never thought about it like that. It's when things are chaotic that new ideas can pop up.
Right. The book uses the example of the first intermediate period in Egypt. It's often portrayed as this chaotic time after the Old Kingdom collapsed.
But they're saying it wasn't just a collapse.
They point out that it was also a time when new religious ideas, art styles, even political experiments were flourishing. Transformation, not just decline.
So those dark ages might have been more like, I don't know, laboratories for new ways of living.
That's the idea. And they make a similar point about the classic Maya period.
The one with the incredible city-states and that complex writing system.
Yep. That period eventually saw those city-states collapse.
Right.
But they caution against just seeing it as a failure. Evidence suggests Maya societies were changing, adapting. Some groups moved away from those big cities and tried new forms of social organization.
So it's about looking beyond that simple rise and fall narrative.
Absolutely. And that brings us to another big theme in the book, violence.
Yeah, it's a tough one, but they don't shy away from it.
Definitely not. They tackle it head on, challenging that whole violence is just human nature argument.
They go back to those retainer burials in ancient Egypt, right?
Yes, it's a brutal reminder of how power can operate. But they also highlight how that kind of violence was often tied to this intense loyalty, a belief in the ruler's divine power.
So it's not just about being aggressive, it's about creating a whole system of beliefs that justifies that violence.
Exactly. And they explore how violence was used not just to create states, but to reshape societies and even the landscape.
Like how early states often force people to settle in one place.
Right, making them easier to control and tax. It's about manipulating the social structure, even the environment, to consolidate power.
Wow. It's not just about physical force, it's about so much more.
And they link this to the rise of bureaucracy. It often emerged as a way to manage these increasingly complex societies. Remember those quipu systems?
Yeah, those knotted strings.
They were tools for managing labor, resources, relationships. But the Inca Empire used them to track labor owed to the state, basically a form of control.
So even systems that start with good intentions can be twisted, used to maintain power imbalances.
It's unsettling, but it's a crucial point. Makes you think critically about our own systems today. But the dawn of everything isn't all doom and gloom. It also offers a really different way of thinking about freedom.
Oh, different how?
Well, they argue that for a lot of human history, people had freedoms we can barely imagine today, freedoms that were just taken for granted.
Okay, I'm all ears. What kinds of freedoms are we talking about?
For one, the freedom to just leave your community, knowing you'd be welcomed in other places. This was common in many indigenous societies.
Like a built-in safety net, a social network that stretched far and wide.
Exactly. It wasn't just practical, it was about choice, about autonomy. People could choose how they wanted to live, experience different ways of life.
So different from how we usually think about freedom today, that individualistic, do whatever I want kind of thing.
Right. This is more about a social freedom, rooted in community and connection. And they talk about the freedom to switch between different social structures, depending on the season or the situation.
Like the Nebuchadnezzar, right. They shifted between more hierarchical and more egalitarian structures, depending on the time of year.
Exactly. It suggests that people weren't locked into just one way of doing things. They had the flexibility to adapt and change as needed.
So it wasn't about finding the perfect system, but about having choices.
And they even point to the freedom to disobey authority without facing harsh consequences.
Really?
It wasn't anarchy, but a different understanding of power. They talk about how chiefs in some indigenous societies had limited power, more like advisors than rulers.
And if they overstepped?
The community could ignore them, ridicule them, even abandon them. Power came from the community, from the collective decision of how to live.
So it challenges that whole top-down power structure we're so used to.
Absolutely. But then the big question is, if people had these freedoms in the past, how did we lose them?
Yeah, how did we end up here?
It's a complex question, and the authors point to a few things. The rise of agriculture, for one. It led to more settled lifestyles, surplus food, which created opportunities for inequality and control.
And the rise of states, obviously.
Right. States often used violence and coercion to solidify their power and suppress those freedoms we talked about.
Makes sense.
And they highlight the role of ideology, those stories we tell ourselves about why things are the way they are. These stories, often rooted in religion or tradition, can be really powerful in justifying inequality.
So it's not just about material conditions, it's about ideas, about how we see ourselves and our place in the world.
Exactly. And the dawn of everything urges us to question those stories, to see them as products of history, not inevitable truths.
It's like they're saying, hey, we've been stuck in this narrow way of thinking for so long that we've forgotten other ways are possible.
Exactly. And they don't just offer critiques, they actually highlight societies that successfully resisted those forces of hierarchy and control.
Okay, give me some hope here. Tell me about these societies.
They talk about groups like the indigenous peoples of North America, who developed sophisticated systems of governance that emphasized consensus and individual autonomy.
Like the Haudenosaunee Confederacy.
Right, the Iroquois Confederacy. They maintained their independence and their way of life for centuries. They had systems to prevent individuals from hoarding power or wealth.
Like how their chiefs were chosen for their ability to persuade, not for their wealth or military strength.
Exactly. And if a chief started acting like a tyrant, the community could remove them, even ridicule them. It was all about balance and accountability.
So not eliminating leadership, but creating a different kind of leadership.
One that serves the community, not self-interest. And they also talk about how rituals and ceremonies played a role in maintaining these egalitarian societies.
Really? How so?
They were often used to redistribute wealth, resolve conflicts, and reaffirm those shared values of cooperation and reciprocity.
So not just about tradition, but about actively shaping and maintaining a just society.
You got it. The dawn of everything wants us to think differently, not just about the past, but about the present and the future, too.
It's about recognizing that we have the power to create the kind of world we want.
Exactly. It's a call to action, to learn from the past and use those lessons to create a future that's more just, equitable, and, well, more human. It really makes you wonder, what other possibilities are out there? What could we learn from those societies that managed to resist hierarchy for so long?
Yeah, good question. It's like we get so caught up in that one standard story of social evolution.
Yep.
From bands to tribes to chiefdoms to states, that we forget to look for other paths.
Right, like there's only one way for humans to organize themselves. The dawn of everything is all about breaking out of that narrow thinking.
So what can we learn from those groups that did things differently, that resisted those pressures towards hierarchy?
Well, the book highlights a few key things. One is consensus decision-making. Lots of those societies had these elaborate systems of councils and assemblies where everyone got a say. Decisions were made through discussion, not by some ruler's decree.
That's so different from how our political systems work now, right? More about finding common ground solutions that work for everyone.
Exactly. And another thing is that focus on balance, preventing anyone from getting too much power.
Yeah, they had ways to distribute wealth, make sure everyone had access to resources.
Right, like those chiefs we talked about, they often had very limited authority. They were chosen for their ability to persuade, not for their wealth or military power.
And if they got too bossy,
The community could remove them, even make fun of them. It was all about keeping things in check, making sure no one got too big for their britches.
so it wasn't about having no leaders, but having a different kind of leadership.
One that's accountable to the community, yeah. And it's interesting, they also talk about how important rituals and ceremonies were in these societies.
Really? What do you mean?
They often use them to redistribute wealth, resolve conflicts, and reaffirm those values of cooperation.
So those rituals weren't just about celebrating tradition, they were actually tools for maintaining a more equal society.
Exactly. And another fascinating thing is their connection to nature, that understanding of how everything is interconnected.
Yeah. It wasn't just some hippie ideal, it was built into their entire way of life.
Right. Their practices, their rituals, their systems of governance all reflected this deep respect for the balance of nature. Makes you think about our own environmental crisis and how it might be connected to, well, that disconnect from nature that's so common in modern Western thought.
That's a pretty deep thought. But one of the most inspiring things about the dawn of everything is how it reframes our understanding of what humans are capable of.
Yeah, it's like they're saying, look, throughout history, humans have created such a wide range of societies, some amazing, some awful. So what kind of world do we want? What future do we choose to build?
It's about recognizing that we have choices, that we're not just stuck on some predetermined path.
Exactly. We're not just passengers on this ride. We're the ones holding the steering wheel.
This book has been such a mind-blowing experience.
I know, right? It really makes you question everything you thought you knew.
It's given me so much to think about.
Me too. And I hope it inspires everyone listening to keep exploring these ideas, to keep questioning those dominant narratives and searching for those hidden histories that can teach us so much about, well, about being human.
That's what Masterminds and Wisdom is all about, right? Exploring these big ideas, challenging our perspectives, and hopefully expanding our understanding of the world and ourselves.
Couldn't have said it better myself.
And a huge thank you to you, our listeners, for bringing us these incredible books and ideas to dive into.
Keep those requests coming.
Absolutely. We love exploring these fascinating topics with you. Until next time, keep those minds curious, those hearts open, and those imaginations running wild.
And remember, the dawn of everything isn't just some event in the past. It's a possibility that exists in every moment, a chance to start fresh, to create a world that reflects our best selves.
Beautifully said. Thanks for joining us on this incredible journey.